G'day, I'm Cahn, and in this video, I'm comparing 12 volt kettles to a standard 240 volt kettle to see which setup is more efficient when you're boiling the same amount of water. Now on paper, a 12 volt kettle should be more efficient. You don't need to worry about conversion losses, plus it should be more affordable because you don't need an inverter or such a big, powerful battery bank. But as the old saying goes, time is money. So what happens when you put these to the test properly? Well, it turns out that the slowest 12 volt kettle took over 20 minutes to boil half a litre of water, while the 240 volt kettle did it in less than 2 minutes. But that's not the real question. The real question is, which setup used more energy? And I reckon the answer isn't going to be as obvious as we think. So here's what I'm working with. The 240 volt kettle is 2,200 watts, and then the 12 volt kettles range from 150 watts to 350 watts. And I probably should have taken a closer look at these two before I bought them because I'm fairly certain they're identical except for the SIG socket or Anderson plug. But as you can already see, there's a massive difference in power in the range, but power isn't everything. What I want to measure is total energy. So to do that, I'm using a Victron Smart Shunt as per usual, so I can actually log what every different kettle uses. And then I've got a 3000 watt inverter to actually power the 240 volt kettle. Then I'll use the different wiring connections I need to connect up the different 12 volt kettles, trying to keep the wiring the same length so everything is fair. Now from previous testing, I know that 3000 watt inverter uses around 13 watts just at idle or on standby. And then when it's running at about 2200 watts of load, which it will be, it should be around 90% efficient. So we'll see how it goes. In terms of what I'm actually boiling, I've got 500 ml of water per kettle per test, and I'm actually going to test every kettle 2 times. So I'll record both numbers and get an average. Now the other reason I'm using 500 ml, it's about 2 cups of tea, which is probably a fair test. It's the minimum that this 240 volt kettle can do, and it's about the midpoint of these smaller 12 volt kettles. So it's not as though I'm filling them all the way to the brim. A quick bit of context and some numbers. When you're boiling water, there's a minimum amount of energy required, the theoretical perfect efficiency. And that is if you were boiling 1 litre of water starting at around 25 degrees Celsius, it'd use around 87 watt hours of energy. You can't argue with that, it's just physics. So I'm doing 500 ml or half a litre. So in perfect conditions, it'd be somewhere between about 43 and 44 watt hours. Now in the real world, that's not likely. So in my case, I'm expecting somewhere between about 50 and 60 watt hours for each of these tests. If we see a number that's much higher than that, it's not that the water heater itself is inefficient, it's that the rest of the system is inefficient. So maybe it's losing heat as it boils to steam, maybe it's the insulation in the actual kettle, or maybe it's just losses in the wiring or conversion. We'll soon find out. So first up, test 1 on the 240 volt kettle. Starting temp about 23 degrees Celsius. Reading 2075 watts on the inverter output, 2232 watts through the shunt. I'm also just going to put a little bit of room temperature water in the kettle, swish it around, pour it out, just to try and cool it down a little bit. I know it's already going to be warmer. And now test 2. (2230 watts), and on the AC output, 2061 watts. So the 240 volt kettle is a great baseline. Here's the numbers. It took about 2 minutes to actually boil the water. Overall, the first test used around 70 watt hours of energy, and the second test, when the element was already a bit warmer, took around 65 watt hours. So now let's get on to the first 12 volt kettle. I've been charging the batteries, I've reset the bench, and now I'm going to test the twins. So these kettles look basically identical. The only real difference is that this one has a SIG plug and this one has an Anderson plug. So what I've done is run the shunt into an Anderson plug, and then I've got an Anderson to SIG socket adapter, and I made up a little Anderson to Anderson adapter, roughly the same length, just so there's no advantage given to one or the other. I think I'm going to start with the Anderson plug one first. Water's still just under 25 degrees, perfect. The first interesting note is that this is actually pulling 198 watts. So it's rated 150, but I wouldn't trust that necessarily. So it's coming up on 20 minutes, and I would argue that that's about to boil, but it's still pulling 200 watts. So, that was perfect timing. So that took just under 20 minutes. Now I'm going to give it a minute and then I'll do another test so it replicates the 240 volt kettle where the element was already warm, but I will swish it out with a little bit of water first. All right, 12 volt kettle, test 2. So that was the second test. Ooh. Now this is hot. Fuse holder's reading about 63 degrees. Hopefully you can read that. So this one, the first test took 64 watt hours of energy and around 20 minutes. The second test was 62 watt hours and around 18.5 minutes after that element was already hot. Now, as you can see, there's already an interesting pattern forming. The fact that this is very close to the energy used by the 240 volt kettle is basically physics at work. There's a set amount of energy that it takes to boil this amount of water, so it doesn't matter whether you deliver a high amount of power for a short time or a small amount of power for a long time, the overall energy is the same, it's just how it's being delivered. Now, let's move on to this one, which I expect will take a little bit longer than this kettle, just due to the connections and the wiring, but we'll see. There we go, we're powered up. Water temperature is still 24.5 degrees, so that's been nice and consistent. Reset the clock. Everything is connected. Now, what was interesting actually about this one is that it was drawing 200 watts when it was at its max. So if this one also draws 200 watts, you definitely wouldn't be able to use this in a typical SIG socket in your vehicle because they're usually rated to 120 watts. So something to consider. All right, so it's kicked on. Currently drawing 180 watts, so we'll see. I'm guessing it's about halfway through boiling this one, and I just wanted to check because the connection here is getting quite warm. Max of about 55, 57, 74.6. Hopefully that's in frame. There you go. So that took about 25 minutes to boil. I'll take a look at the shunt data in a second, but let's see how much water we've got left and then do test number 2. 85 degrees. That's very hot. So it may have damaged the spring that holds the fuse in place because it looks heat damaged. I've tried to stretch this spring back out. I'll put it all back together, give it a minute, and then do number 2 test on this one. What's the water temp? 24.7. Let's see how we go. So this kettle, the first test, took about 25.5 minutes and used 74 watt hours of energy. Second test, when it was already warm, took about 24 minutes and 68 watt hours of energy. So on average, it used 71 watt hours of energy for the 2 boil tests. Now finally, I've got this one, which is 350 watts compared to the 150 watts that these two were. Slightly different shape, slightly taller, but smaller capacity. So we'll see how it goes. So water temperature is around 25 degrees. All right, so finally this 350 watt quick boil kettle. Now I've actually removed the small Anderson extension because this uses thicker gauge wiring and I didn't want a thinner piece in between that would actually affect this. So I use the same wiring for the same kettles. I've just gone to the straight Anderson plug now. We'll start it up. Immediately drawing 428 watts. Let's see how we go. So that's test one, about or just under 8.5 minutes and 56 watt hours. So like the others, I'll give it a minute. Water temp is still 24.7 degrees. So they've all been around 23, 24 degrees, which is great. I'll swish this with some cold water. I'll get 500 ml into here. So the second boil was 7 minutes 41 and took 50.8 watt hours of energy. So on average, this one used 53.5 watt hours of energy on average over the two boils. So I guess now it's time to tidy the bench and wrap this up. So what you'll really notice here is that the biggest difference really isn't energy used, it's absolutely time. It only takes 2 to 3 minutes to boil 500 ml of water in a 240 volt kettle. It's about 8 minutes in the 350 watt kettle, and then it's roughly 20 to 25 minutes in these 150 watt kettles. The actual energy used to boil, if I just look at the first test before each of the elements was heated, it ranged between about 55 and 75 watt hours, which isn't a huge difference, but it's definitely noticeable. But what is interesting is that in terms of efficiency, a 12 volt kettle actually came both first and last. The 240 volt kettle, even including inverter losses, sits roughly in the middle, very close to another 12 volt kettle. And I made sure to factor in the starting temperature of each test for more accurate results. So it's not really a 12 volt versus 240 volt thing, it's more about the whole system, how it's designed, how it's powered, and how long it's actually running for. Because even the two 150 watt kettles that looked almost identical ended up performing very differently. In practice, this comes down to how you actually would want to use your setup. If you want a quick cup of tea in a couple of minutes, pull up on the side of the track, it's got to be a 240 volt kettle because it's the only one that has the power to heat the water that fast. But that does come with the added complications of needing the bigger battery bank with better power output and the inverter as well. What was interesting though is just how efficient the 350 watt kettle was. That really surprised me. I reckon if you were driving, you had a couple of minutes to spare, or you just wanted to have a slower morning, waiting 7 or 8 minutes for a cup of tea, or in fact 2 cups of tea, really isn't all that long. You could kick back and relax at camp while this boils relatively quickly. So again, it all comes down to how you actually camp. And there are going to be people out there that say just use a gas stove, or why not just use a campfire? And yes, that is 100% true. However, if you want a quick cuppa, you can't beat a kettle. These are just so much faster and more efficient. Not to mention they're going to be cleaner and you don't actually have to start a fire to make a cup of tea. Not as fun, but more efficient. So after all that, would I recommend a 12 volt kettle, or would I buy a 12 volt kettle myself? I guess the answer is yes, because I bought all 3 of these for this test. But after the test, would I still recommend them? And the answer is yes, with some conditions. These 150 watt kettles work perfectly fine for what they are if you're willing to wait 20, 25 minutes. And that's to be expected because they are such low power, no fault of their own. They're just low power. So if you had a small battery or a power pack, these might be a great option. This one pulled about 200 watts through the shunt. This one was pulling 180 watts. So this one with the Anderson plug, no worries. This one with the SIG socket, SIG plug, you'd have to be very mindful of. And I don't know how that'd go in most SIG sockets that are limited to about 120 watts. Some can do 150. I'll have to give this one a test in a SIG socket in a vehicle and see how it actually goes. However, this one here really impressed me. 350 watts, so you do need a little bit more of a significant output on your battery or your 12 volt system, but it was fast, 7 or 8 minutes to boil 2 cups of water, and it was the most efficient of any of the setups I tested. Now, I only bought this one because it was local. I could go pick it up and it was on sale, which was nice. I'm sure there are other brands or models that are similar, but this one particularly did impress me. I'm gonna keep using it, and I think maybe not for actually making cups of tea. I have an idea that I might want to try and turn this into a shower or water heater for a shower, but we'll see. Because one thing I didn't mention is that you can actually set the temperature. I think it's from 50 to 100 degrees Celsius in increments of 5. Don't quote me on that. I think it was around there, maybe 55 degrees to 100 degrees. So it could probably be used to heat a bit more water for something like a shower, but that is probably a denied warranty claim waiting to happen. So don't do this at home. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video. If you've got a 12 volt kettle, let me know how you go, or if you just went straight for the 240 volt one, makes sense to me. But if anyone's got a model like this, please let me know how it's going long term, because again, I was quite impressed with it. As always, thank you everyone for watching, and particularly thanks to my channel members. It means a massive amount. If anyone else does want to join, it's open, but it's completely optional. I'm going to keep making these hopefully helpful videos regardless. And until next time, cheers.